The clinking of crystal glasses hid the sudden, sharp intake of breath, but the silence that followed in his mind was deafening. The most feared man in New York's underworld didn't flinch at federal indictments or rival guns, but seeing the dark, plum-colored marks on the trembling, pregnant maid holding his drink, that tore his entire empire apart. The Castellano estate in Oyster Bay was a fortress masquerading as a monument to new money. Beyond the wrought iron gates and the meticulously manicured topiary, the mansion hummed with the quiet, dangerous energy of power. Tonight, Dominic Castellano, the undisputed head of the Castellano Syndicate, was hosting a charity gala. It was a flawless masquerade, a room filled with state senators, Wall Street executives, and high-ranking capos wearing Brioni suits, all pretending they didn't know exactly where the money funding the champagne had come from. Dominic stood near the grand marble fireplace, a bespoke charcoal suit hugging his broad frame. At 32, his reputation preceded him. He was a man carved from ice and reinforced steel, known for a terrifyingly calm demeanor that made even the most hardened criminals sweat. He was untouchable, operating a vast network of construction, shipping, and less savory enterprises with a ruthless efficiency that had caught the attention of the Commission and the FBI alike. Yet, amidst the glittering chandeliers and the soft hum of a string quartet playing Vivaldi, Dominic was entirely detached. His dark eyes scanned the room, cataloging loyalties and unspoken debts. He was listening to Senator Reynolds drone on about zoning permits when a sudden, jarring sound shattered his concentration. A silver tray clattered against the polished mahogany of a side table. Dominic's gaze snapped toward the noise. It was a maid, part of the temporary staff hired from an elite catering agency for the evening. She was frantically gathering the spilled napkins and a tipped crystal flute, her movements jerky and panicked. The head butler was already marching toward her, his face flushed with quiet fury, ready to dismiss her on the spot. Dominic wouldn't have given the scene a second thought. Incompetence usually bored him, but something about the tilt of her head, the frantic, bird-like way she ducked her shoulders to avoid the butler's looming presence, sent a strange jolt through his chest. "Leave it," Dominic suddenly commanded, his deep voice slicing through the low murmur of the crowd. The butler froze, instantly stepping back. "Apologies, Mr. Castellano. I will have her replaced immediately," I said. "Leave it. Go attend to the senator," Dominic murmured, not taking his eyes off the crouching woman. The maid kept her head bowed, her dark hair pinned back tightly under a crisp white cap. She was wearing a standard black uniform that looked completely wrong on her. As she struggled to stand, clutching the tray to her chest, Dominic's breath hitched. She turned slightly to apologize, her face catching the light of the chandelier. It was Isabella Ricci, the girl from Bensonhurst, the girl who used to sit on the fire escape with him when they were 12, sharing stolen cherry popsicles while sirens wailed in the distance. The girl whose scraped knees he had bandaged, and who, in turn, had tried to bandage his bruised soul when his father first introduced him to the family business. She was the only sliver of light from a past he had systematically buried. He had forced himself to walk away from her 10 years ago, violently severing their ties, convinced that his darkening world would eventually swallow her whole. He had let her go so she could find a safe, normal life. But the woman standing before him was a ghost of the vibrant girl he remembered. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes wide and rimmed with an exhaustion so profound it looked painful. And then, his eyes dropped lower. Beneath the stark black apron, the unmistakable, heavy curve of a late-stage pregnancy protruded. She was easily 7, perhaps 8 months along. Dominic felt a cold void open in his stomach. Isabella was pregnant. She was working as a temporary maid at a mob boss's gala. This wasn't the life she was supposed to have. She was supposed to be a teacher, married to some boring, respectable man in the suburbs. "I am so sorry, sir," Isabella whispered, her voice a fragile, raspy thread that barely reached him. She hadn't looked at his face. She was staring fixedly at his polished Italian leather shoes. "I lost my grip. It won't happen again." As she spoke, she reached up nervously to adjust the stiff, white collar of her uniform. The fabric shifted, pulling away from her skin for just a fraction of a second. Time seemed to stop for Dominic. There, blooming violently against the pale skin of her lower neck and collarbone, were bruises. They were not the vague, yellowish marks of a clumsy accident. They were distinct, dark, thumb-shaped contusions, the unmistakable, brutal grip of a man's hand. A primal, violent roar echoed in Dominic's mind, though his physical expression remained a mask of stone. The clinking glasses, the string quartet, the murmuring politicians, everything faded into white noise. The beast he kept meticulously chained, the ruthless mob boss, who commanded an army of dangerous men, violently threw off its restraints. "Isabella?" he said. Her name slipped from his lips, rough and heavy. The tray in her hands rattled violently. Slowly, agonizingly, her eyes dragged upward. Her gaze traveled up his tall frame, past the silk tie, until her widened, terrified eyes locked onto his face. The color drained completely from her already pale cheeks. "Dominic?" she breathed, the tray nearly slipping from her hands again. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized her features. She took a step back, her hand instinctively coming up to shield her swollen stomach. It wasn't just the shock of seeing him. It was the sheer terror of being seen by him in this state. The shame radiated from her in waves. "Excuse me," she choked out, her voice cracking. I have to get back to the kitchen." She didn't wait for a dismissal. Isabella turned on her heel and practically fled toward the swinging doors of the servants' corridor, her heavy, pregnant gait making her escape look desperately tragic. Dominic stood rooted to the spot for exactly 3 seconds. He turned to his underboss, Leo, who was watching him with a raised eyebrow. "Keep the senator happy," Dominic ordered, his voice dangerously soft. "No one disturbs me for the next 20 minutes. If someone tries, break their legs." Without waiting for Leo's nod, Dominic moved. The vast industrial kitchen of the estate was a chaotic symphony of shouting chefs and clattering pans, but Dominic bypassed the main floor, his long strides eating up the distance as he headed for the quiet, narrow pantry hallway in the back. He found her there, leaning heavily against a steel shelving unit lined with imported truffles and saffron. She was hyperventilating, her hands gripping the edges of the shelf so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Dominic closed the heavy oak door behind him, the thick wood instantly muffling the noise of the kitchen. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the confined space. Isabella jumped, spinning around. When she saw him, she shrank back against the shelves, cornered. "Dom, please," she whispered, a desperate plea in her tear-filled eyes. "Please don't look at me. Let me just leave. I'll tell the agency I was sick. I didn't know this was your house. I swear I didn't know." Dominic stepped closer, moving slowly, like one might approach a wounded, terrified animal. The closer he got, the more the reality of her condition tore at him. Her uniform was threadbare at the seams. Her shoes were cheap, unsupportive canvas slip-ons, completely inadequate for a woman carrying a child on her feet all night. "Who did it?" Dominic asked. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a lethal, quiet whisper that carried a promise of absolute destruction. Isabella's hands flew to her collar, desperately trying to pull the fabric higher over the bruises. "Nothing. I fell. I tripped on the stairs at my apartment. You know how clumsy I am, Dom." "Don't," he commanded softly, closing the final gap between them. He stopped just inches away. He was tall enough that he had to look down at her, but he made sure to keep his hands carefully at his sides, terrified that any sudden movement would break her. "Don't lie to me, Izzy. Not you. Never you." A staircase doesn't leave finger marks on a woman's throat. A choked sob escaped her lips. She turned her face away, staring hard at the floor tiles. The childhood nickname Izzy shattered the last of her defenses. 10 years of distance dissolved in the suffocating air of the pantry. "It's Arthur," she whispered, the name tasting like ash. "My husband, Arthur Pendleton." Dominic's mind raced. Arthur Pendleton, an investment banker, a man Isabella had started dating just months after Dominic had intentionally pushed her away, playing the role of the heartless street thug so she would run toward a better life. Pendleton was supposed to be her safe harbor, a man with a 401k, a house in the suburbs, and clean hands. "He hits you," Dominic stated, the words tasting like poison on his tongue. He gets stressed," she stammered. falling into the rote mechanical excuses of a battered wife. The market has been bad. He lost his job a year ago. He's been trying to day trade to make it back, but it's gone wrong. All our savings, gone. He froze my access to our remaining accounts. I had to take this job under a fake maiden name just to get cash for prenatal vitamins. If he finds out I'm working, he'll. She stopped, her hand trembling violently over her swollen belly. Dominic's jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. He hits a pregnant woman. He chokes the woman carrying his child. "It's worse, Dom," she cried softly, the tears finally spilling over her lashes. "It's the people he owes money to. He's terrified. He owes over $800,000 to some private lenders, sharks. They've been calling the house. They threatened to burn it down with me inside if he doesn't pay. That's why he's so angry. He drinks, and then he looks at me, and..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Dominic felt a sudden, icy stillness settle over his heart. He knew the underworld of New York better than he knew the lines on his own palms. Legitimate bankers who lost their jobs and tried to aggressively day trade their way out of debt didn't borrow from standard loan sharks. They went to the big players. They went to the syndicates. "Izzy," Dominic said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Who does he owe the money to? What name did these men give?" Isabella swallowed hard, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I don't know exactly. I heard him crying on the phone last week. He kept begging a man named Silvio. He said to tell the boss that he just needed one more month." Dominic stopped breathing. Silvio the Hammer Dante. He was one of Dominic's own Caporegimes. Silvio ran the high-level loan sharking operations out of a front company in Queens. The horrifying puzzle pieces snapped together in Dominic's brilliant, calculating mind. Arthur Pendleton had borrowed money from the Castellano family. When Pendleton couldn't pay, Silvio had applied the standard, ruthless pressure Dominic himself mandated. And Arthur, weak, pathetic, cowardly Arthur, had brought that terror home and taken his stress out on his pregnant wife. Dominic's own empire, his own orders, had indirectly caused the bruises on Isabella's throat. He had built this dark, violent world to keep her out of it, and instead, it had reached out and wrapped its hands around her neck. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the pantry. Isabella looked up at him, misinterpreting his silence for judgment or dismissal. "I'm sorry," she whispered, stepping back. "I shouldn't have burdened you with this. We aren't those kids anymore, Dom. I'll just go." As she reached for the doorknob, Dominic's hand shot out. He didn't grab her wrist. He merely placed his large, warm palm flat against the heavy oak door, preventing her from opening it. He looked down at her, his dark eyes stripping away the years, the money, and the blood on his hands. In that moment, he wasn't the untouchable boss of the Castellano family. He was just the boy from Bensonhurst, looking at the only thing he had ever truly loved, broken and battered, because of a monster she married, and a monster he had become. "You aren't going anywhere, Isabella," Dominic said, and the absolute certainty in his tone made her freeze. "Dom, you are going to walk out the back door of this kitchen," he instructed, his voice dropping an octave, layered with a quiet, terrifying authority. "My driver, Marco, is waiting by the black SUV. You are going to get in. He will take you to a penthouse in Manhattan that only I have the keys to. There is security, a private chef, and an on-call doctor." Isabella shook her head frantically. "I can't. Arthur will." "Arthur Pendleton," Dominic interrupted, his eyes turning to flat, obsidian glass, "is a dead man." Isabella gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "He touched what was mine," Dominic whispered, reaching out to gently, reverently brush a stray lock of hair away from her bruised neck. His touch was lighter than a feather, terrified of hurting her further. "He brought my violence into your home. And for that, I am going to erase him from the face of this earth." The sleek, armored SUV glided through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, leaving the sprawling Castellano estate far behind. In the back seat, Isabella sat paralyzed, her hands protectively cradling her swollen abdomen. The tinted windows offered a blurred, neon-streaked view of a city she barely recognized anymore. Up front, Marco, a massive man with a broken nose and a perfectly tailored suit, drove in absolute, respectful silence. He hadn't asked questions. He had simply opened the door, nodded to her, and locked her safely inside. They arrived at a discreet, ultra-luxury high-rise on Central Park South. There was no public lobby, only a private subterranean garage and a dedicated elevator that scanned Marco's fingerprint before ascending directly to the top floor. When the brass doors parted, Isabella stepped into a sprawling penthouse bathed in the soft glow of recessed lighting. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the dark expanse of the park. The air smelled of clean linen and expensive cedarwood. Waiting in the foyer was an older man, with kind eyes and a black medical bag. "Mrs. Pendleton? I am Dr. Harrison," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Mr. Castellano requested I be here to ensure you and the baby are in no immediate distress. Please, come sit." For the next hour, the terrifying reality of her situation was momentarily suspended by the clinical, comforting routine of a medical exam. Dr. Slosh Harrison checked her vitals, documented the horrific bruising on her neck with a grim, professional silence, and finally, produced a portable fetal Doppler. When the rapid, strong swoosh thump of her baby's heartbeat filled the quiet bedroom, Isabella finally broke. She wept, entirely consumed by the crushing relief that her child was still alive, still fighting. Miles away, the relief Isabella felt was entirely absent from the subterranean office beneath the Onyx Room, Dominic's flagship nightclub in Chelsea. The heavy, soundproof door clicked shut, sealing the room in oppressive silence. Dominic sat behind a massive desk of reclaimed mahogany, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate ink of his syndicate tattoos tracing up his forearms. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, not to drink, but to give his hands something to do other than wrap around a throat. Across from him stood Silvio Dante, a man who built a lucrative, terrifying reputation breaking knees for late payments. Right now, Silvio looked like he was about to face a firing squad. Beside him stood Leo, Dominic's underboss, watching the exchange with hawkish intensity. "Silvio," Dominic began, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the tone his men feared most. Yelling meant Dominic was angry. Whispering meant someone was already dead. "Tell me about a ledger entry under the name Arthur Pendleton." Silvio swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing the line of his jaw. "Pendleton. Right. Upper West Side guy, used to be a banker. Blew his severance on offshore crypto and underground baccarat tables in Macau. He came to us 6 months ago. Borrowed 800 grand. Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly. He told his wife he lost at day trading. He told her the market was bad. Day trading? Silvio let out a nervous, humorless scoff. "Boss, the guy is a degenerate. He hasn't touched a stock in 2 years. He's been blowing the cash on high-stakes poker rings run by the Volkov brat in Brighton Beach, and dropping the rest on high-end escorts. When he couldn't pay us the vig last month, I put the squeeze on him. Standard operating procedure. I told him we'd burn his life down." Dominic stared at the amber liquid in his glass. Arthur hadn't just made a mistake. He hadn't just been a desperate man trying to provide for his pregnant wife. He was a parasite, draining their life savings for vice, and dragging the violent consequences of his addictions directly into Isabella's home. "Did you know?" Dominic asked slowly, his dark eyes rising to lock onto Silvio's. "That Arthur Pendleton is married to Isabella Ricci, the girl I grew up with, the girl whose father practically raised me when mine was in federal lockup." The color completely vanished from Silvio's face. His knees visibly buckled, and he grabbed the back of a leather guest chair to steady himself. Boss, I swear on my mother's soul, I didn't know. He never mentioned her. If I had known she was under your protection." "She wasn't," Dominic cut in, the admission tasting like ash. "But she is now." Dominic stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. He walked around the desk, his presence filling the room with suffocating authority. "Where is he right now?" He's supposed to be at a sit-down with one of my lieutenants at a diner in Queens, begging for an extension," Silvio stammered. Dominic looked at Leo. "Pick him up. Do not make a scene. Bring him to the Red Hook warehouse." "And Leo?" "Yeah, boss. Make sure he's fully awake when I get there." Before heading to Brooklyn, Dominic returned to the penthouse. The transition from the violent underworld to this quiet sanctuary felt jarring, yet entirely necessary. He needed to see her. He needed to know she was still real, still breathing, still the Isabella he remembered. He found her in the expansive kitchen, drowning in one of his oversized plush white robes, clutching a mug of chamomile tea. The bruising on her neck looked even more vivid under the harsh daylight pouring through the morning windows, a grotesque stain on an otherwise fragile canvas. When she saw him, she stood up quickly, a lingering instinct of fear still dictating her movements. "You don't have to stand up for me, Izzy," he said softly, keeping his distance, leaning against the marble island. "Dr. Harrison said the baby is healthy." "He is," she whispered, her hand resting on her stomach. She looked at the city skyline, unable to meet his intense gaze. "Dominic, what happens now? I can't stay here. Arthur will tear the city apart looking for me. If he thinks I've run away, he'll do something crazy. He owes terrible people a lot of money." "You don't ever have to worry about the people he owes money to again," Dominic said smoothly. "You don't understand," she pleaded, turning to him with tears welling in her eyes. "He said they are animals. He said they will kill me to send him a message." A bitter, dark amusement flickered in Dominic's chest, quickly buried by rage. Animals. Arthur had played the victim flawlessly, terrifying his wife with the phantom of the mob, using it as an excuse to beat her, while he spent her future on cards and women. "He's right about one thing," Dominic murmured, stepping closer until he could smell the faint scent of vanilla and medical alcohol on her skin. "There are monsters in this city. But you are looking at the man who holds their leashes." Isabella froze, her eyes searching his face. The boy she knew, the one who bought her popsicles and protected her from local bullies, was completely gone. In his place stood a king of shadows. Yet, strangely, looking into his eyes, she didn't feel the paralyzing terror she felt when Arthur looked at her. She felt an overwhelming, undeniable sense of safety. "Stay here," Dominic instructed, gently pulling the collar of her robe up to conceal the bruises, his knuckles grazing her jawline. "Eat. Rest. Let Marco know if you need anything. By tonight, you will be a free woman." He didn't wait for her to ask what he meant. He couldn't. If she asked, he would have to lie to her, and he had promised himself he would never do that. 45 minutes later, Dominic's black SUV pulled into an abandoned shipping warehouse in Red Hook. The smell of rusted iron, low tide, and stale motor oil hung thick in the damp air. Inside, beneath the harsh glare of a single swinging halogen bulb, Arthur Pendleton was tied to a reinforced steel chair. Arthur was a handsome man by standard. Country club metrics, sandy blonde hair, a strong jawline, dressed in an expensive, wrinkled Oxford shirt. But right now, his face was contorted in abject terror. He was shivering violently, his eyes darting frantically around the cavernous, shadowy room. When Dominic stepped into the circle of light, Arthur's breath hitched. He didn't know Dominic personally, but every man who swam in the muddy waters of New York's illegal gambling scene knew the face of the Castellano boss. "Mr. Castellano," Arthur gasped, his voice cracking violently. "Sir, please, there's been a mistake. I was meeting Silvio's guy. I have a plan to get the money. I just need a week." Dominic didn't say a word. He walked slowly around the chair, his heavy footsteps echoing off the concrete. He stopped in front of Arthur, looking down at the man with the detached curiosity of an entomologist studying a cockroach. "You owe my family $850,000, Dominic stated, his voice devoid of any inflection. I know. Arthur wept, straining against the zip ties cutting into his wrists. The market tanked. I got desperate. "Do not lie to me," Dominic interrupted, the sudden, razor-sharp edge in his voice making Arthur flinch as if he'd been struck. "We know about the baccarat tables. We know about the escorts. We know you leveraged your wife's childhood home without her signature to get the initial buy-in for Volkov's game." Arthur's face drained of blood. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The jig was up. He was staring death in the face. But then, the survival instinct of a true sociopath kicked in. Arthur's panic suddenly morphed into a sickening, desperate cunning. He leaned forward as much as the bindings would allow, his voice dropping to a frantic, conspiratorial whisper. Look, hear me out, Arthur babbled, sweat dripping from his nose. I don't have the cash, I admit it. But I have an asset. A massive asset. We can wipe the slate clean. And you can keep the change. Dominic remained perfectly still, a statue of impending violence. What asset? My wife, Arthur said, his eyes wild. Isabella, she's pregnant. High risk. Placenta previa, the doctors said. Her blood pressure is a mess, Arthur swallowed, licking his dry lips. 6 months ago, I took out a comprehensive life insurance policy on her. $5 million. Covers accidental death, complications during childbirth. Anything. The silence in the warehouse became absolute. Even Leo, standing in the shadows, shifted uncomfortably, disgusted by the sheer depravity of the man in the chair. Are you telling me, Dominic said, his voice dropping so low it vibrated in the damp air, that you intend to pay my syndicate with the life insurance money of your pregnant wife? She's weak anyway, Arthur justified, mistaking Dominic's quietness for business interest. I've been applying pressure, trying to stress her out, trying to induce a spike in her vitals. A fall down the stairs, a sudden heart failure from the stress. It wouldn't be questioned. The payout goes directly to a trust I control. We split it. $5 million, Mr. Castellano. I just need your guys to arrange a little accident at the apartment. Make it look like a break-in gone wrong. Arthur offered up his wife and unborn child to a mob boss, with the casual desperation of a man trading in a used car. Dominic closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw Isabella standing in the kitchen, trembling, wearing his robe, trying to hide the bruises Arthur had left on her neck. He saw the 12-year-old girl with scraped knees who had shared her cherry popsicle with him. He had intended to punish Arthur for the disrespect to his syndicate and for hurting the woman he loved. But this wasn't just a beating. This was a calculated, premeditated murder of the only pure thing left in Dominic's world. Dominic opened his eyes. The last shred of humanity in them had vanished, replaced by an abyss of pure, unadulterated hellfire. He leaned down until his face was inches from Arthur's. Here is what is going to happen, Arthur, Dominic whispered, the lethal calm of his voice far more terrifying than a scream. You are not going to have an accident. You are going to write a detailed, handwritten confession of your gambling debts and your intent to flee the country to avoid the Volkov family. You are going to sign over every single asset, every penny, the deed to the house, and the life insurance policy to a blind trust solely controlled by Isabella. Arthur shook his head frantically, finally realizing his catastrophic miscalculation. No, wait, please. And then, Dominic continued, ignoring the plea, you are going to board a private cargo freighter owned by my family, bound for a very remote, very hostile port in the Gulf of Guinea. You will be stripped of your name, your passport, and your freedom. You will spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic, life-breaking rocks in a lithium mine, where men die for a glass of dirty water. Dominic stood up, straightening his cuffs, turning his back on the weeping, screaming man. Leo, Dominic called out into the shadows. Yes, boss. Get the paperwork signed, and if he hesitates for even a second. Dominic paused, looking over his shoulder at Arthur one last time. Break his hands. He won't need them to mine rock. When Dominic returned to the Central Park South penthouse, the city was draped in the glittering, indifferent lights of the Manhattan skyline. He found Isabella sitting in the exact same spot he had left her, staring out at the darkness. The tension in her shoulders was palpable, a physical manifestation of a woman waiting for the other shoe to drop. He walked into the room, the heavy silence broken only by the soft click of his leather shoes on the hardwood floor. He placed a thick, sealed manila envelope on the marble kitchen island. Isabella flinched slightly at the sound, her eyes darting to the package. What is that? Your freedom, Dominic said quietly. Isabella stood up, pulling the thick robe tighter around her swollen belly. With trembling hands, she reached for the envelope, sliding out the crisp, legally binding documents. At the top was a letter bearing the letterhead of J.P. Morgan Chase Private Bank. Beneath it was a handwritten note. She recognized the sharp, frantic scrawl immediately. It was Arthur's handwriting. Isabella, I am sorry. The Volkov syndicate is going to kill me. I've signed over the house, the remaining accounts, and the insurance policy to a blind trust in your name. I am leaving the country tonight. Do not look for me. They will find you if you do. Isabella read the words 3 times, the air slowly leaving her lungs. She looked at the trust documents, $5 million, clean and completely under her control. The crushing, suffocating weight of debt, fear, and impending violence that had choked her for the last year vanished in a single instant. He's gone? She whispered, her voice fracturing. Just like that? He abandoned his own child to save his own skin? Arthur was a coward, Isabella, Dominic said, stepping closer, his voice a steady, grounding force in the chaotic storm of her emotions. He was entirely consumed by his own survival. But you never have to look over your shoulder again. The Volkov family has been handled. They will not come looking for his debts. Isabella looked up into Dominic's dark, fathomless eyes. She wasn't naive. She had grown up in the same Bensonhurst neighborhoods he had. She knew exactly what handled meant in his world, and she knew Arthur hadn't simply decided to write a convenient confession and board a flight out of guilt. Dominic had orchestrated this. He had wielded his terrifying empire like a scalpel to excise the cancer from her life. She expected to feel horror. She expected to fear the man standing in front of her, a man who could make a husband disappear into thin air without leaving a single fingerprint behind. Instead, as she looked at the faded scars on his knuckles and the exhaustion lining his handsome face, all she felt was an overwhelming, crashing wave of gratitude. Suddenly, Isabella gasped, dropping the papers. Her hands flew to her stomach as her knees buckled. Dominic moved with terrifying speed, catching her before she hit the floor. The cool, collected mob boss vanished, replaced by sheer, unfiltered panic. Izzy, what is it? It's too early, she cried out, her fingers digging painfully into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. Dom, the baby, my water just broke. The next 20 minutes were a blur of absolute, highly coordinated chaos. Dominic didn't bother with an ambulance. Marco had the armored SUV idling at the private curb in seconds. Dominic carried Isabella through the subterranean garage, his face a mask of iron as he barked orders into his phone. By the time they arrived at New York Presbyterian, Weill Cornell Medical Center, the hospital's VIP maternity wing had been entirely secured. 2 of Dominic's most trusted men stood by the elevator banks, their suits tailored perfectly over concealed weapons. The hospital administrators didn't ask questions. They simply cleared the path for the city's most dangerous man and the fiercely protected woman in his arms. In the sterile, brightly lit delivery room, Dominic refused to leave. When the doctors tried to usher him out, citing protocol, one icy, dead-eyed glare from the syndicate boss silenced them completely. He stood by Isabella's head, letting her crush his hand every time a contraction ripped through her fragile body. He whispered to her in Italian, the old, comforting words of their childhood, keeping her anchored to the present. Hours later, the sharp, piercing cry of a newborn shattered the tension in the room. "It's a boy, Mrs. Pendleton," the attending physician smiled, carefully wrapping the tiny, wriggling infant in a heated blanket before placing him on Isabella's chest. Isabella wept openly, burying her face in the baby's soft, dark hair. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and completely untouched by the violence that had surrounded his conception. Dominic stood back, giving her space, a profound ache blooming in his chest. He had done his job. She was safe. She was wealthy. She had her child. It was time for him to step back into the shadows where he belonged, so his darkness wouldn't taint them. He turned toward the door. "Where are you going?" Isabella's weak, exhausted voice stopped him in his tracks. Dominic paused, his hand on the stainless steel doorknob. "You have your life back, Izzy. A clean slate. I'm going to let you live it." "No," she said. Dominic turned around, surprised by the absolute steel in her voice. Isabella adjusted the baby in her arms, her dark eyes locking onto his. The bruised, terrified maid from the gala was gone. In her place was a mother, fierce and awakened. Arthur was supposed to be the clean slate, Dominic. "And he almost killed me," she whispered, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "I don't want clean. I want safe. You promised you would never leave me when we were kids, and you broke that promise to protect me. Look where that got us." She reached out a trembling hand toward him. "Don't walk away this time. We are your family." Dominic stared at her outstretched hand, the walls of his meticulously constructed, isolated empire crumbling into dust. He crossed the room, dropping to his knees beside the hospital bed. He carefully wrapped his large, scarred hands around hers, leaning his forehead against the pristine white sheets. For the first time in a decade, the boss of the Castellano family finally surrendered. The bruises on Isabella's skin eventually faded, replaced by the fierce, untouchable protection of the Castellano syndicate. Dominic had built a ruthless, criminal empire to survive the dark, but ultimately, that very empire allowed him to save the only light he ever loved. The broken maid was gone. In her place stood the fiercely protected matriarch of New York's most powerful family, finally safe, finally loved, and finally home.